Somewhere in a small drawer, in millions of homes around the world, sits a small foil packet that most people never think twice about. It's cheap, it's disposable, it's taken for granted. But that little packet is the end point of a story that stretches back over 10,000 years, through kings, plagues, robber barons, and one very determined Italian anatomist. How did humans go from animal gut to modern latex? And why did it take so unbelievably long to get there? The story doesn't start in a lab, it starts in fear. Long before anyone understood viruses or bacteria, humans understood consequences. Disease spread, pregnancies came at the wrong time, and somewhere in the deep, undocumented past, someone had an idea: cover it, and maybe you can stop what spreads. Cave paintings in France, dated by some researchers to as far back as 11,000 BC, appear to show men wearing coverings during intercourse, though what exactly those images depict is still debated. Nothing about this was scientific. It was closer to guesswork, stacked on top of guesswork, generation after generation, slowly inching towards something that worked. By around 1000 BC, ancient Egyptians were using linen sheaths. Historians still argue about the primary purpose. Some believe it was protection from disease. Others think it was simply to guard against insect bites during sex in a hot climate. Either way, the concept had arrived. A barrier, worn on the body, standing between one person and whatever the other person might be carrying. Isn't it strange that an idea this basic took thousands of years to become reliable? Ancient Rome and Greece reportedly experimented with animal bladders, a method that shows up again and again across unrelated cultures throughout history, almost like different civilizations kept rediscovering the same imperfect solution independently. There's also a well-known legend from around 3000 BC involving King Minos of Crete, said to have used a goat's bladder as an internal sheath to protect his partner, according to old mythology. Historians are quick to point out that the story blends legend with almost no hard evidence. But true or not, it tells you something important. The idea of protection during sex isn't a modern concern bolted onto ancient people. It's something ancient people were already anxious about, myth-making around, trying to solve. For most of history, though, solving it meant living with something genuinely uncomfortable. By the Renaissance, animal intestines, usually from sheep or goats, became the material of choice across much of Europe. This wasn't a random shift. Europe was in the grip of devastating syphilis epidemics following contact with the Americas, and suddenly, protection wasn't a philosophical nicety, it was survival. This is where the Italian anatomist Gabriele Falloppio enters the story. In 1564, Falloppio published one of the first detailed medical descriptions of a protective sheath, a linen covering soaked in a chemical solution, which he claimed to have tested on more than 1,000 men, reporting real success in preventing syphilis transmission. Whether or not his numbers held up to modern scrutiny, Falloppio's work marked a turning point. This was no longer folklore, it was medicine trying to catch up with a problem that had been killing people for generations. From there, animal intestine sheaths slowly spread beyond medical circles and into everyday use, sold quietly in pubs, barbershops, and apothecaries across Europe and parts of Asia. They weren't cheap. A single sheath could cost real money, so most men who bought one didn't throw it away after a single use. They washed it, dried it, reused it, sometimes for months. An idea that sounds almost unthinkable today, but made complete sense in an economy where a condom was a genuine investment. One of history's more famous users understood exactly how unreliable this technology could be. Giacomo Casanova, the 18th century writer notorious for his romantic exploits, reportedly inflated his condoms like balloons before use, checking carefully for tiny holes that could render the whole thing useless. Picture that for a second. One of history's most infamous lovers, quality testing his own protection by blowing it up like a party favor, because there was simply no other way to know if it would fail. So why, with demand this high, and stakes this serious, did it take until the 1800s for anything to fundamentally change? Because the missing piece wasn't willpower, it was chemistry. Animal intestine, no matter how carefully prepared, has natural limitations. It's inconsistent in thickness. It tears unpredictably. And nobody in the 1500s, or the 1600s, or even the 1700s, had a material that could reliably replace it. That gap wouldn't close until an American inventor accidentally solved a completely different problem. In 1839, Charles Goodyear discovered vulcanization, a process that transforms raw, unstable rubber into something durable, flexible, and heat-resistant by treating it with sulfur under controlled heat. Goodyear wasn't trying to revolutionize contraception. He was trying to make rubber usable at all, since untreated rubber tends to go sticky in summer and brittle in winter, essentially useless as a material you could depend on. But once vulcanization existed, its applications exploded far beyond what Goodyear ever intended. And one of the earliest, most consequential applications was the rubber condom, which reached the market by 1855. There's a real historical dispute worth mentioning here. Some historians credit Goodyear with the discovery. Others point to Thomas Hancock, an English inventor, who patented a version of vulcanization in Britain in 1843, close enough in timing that the true originator is still debated. What isn't debated is the impact. For the first time, condoms could be manufactured at scale, out of a consistent material, priced low enough for ordinary working people to actually afford. But early rubber condoms were far from perfect. They were thick, sometimes compared to the material of a bicycle inner tube. Many were custom-fitted, reused, and prone to breaking. And in the United States, this new accessibility triggered a backlash rather than celebration. The Comstock laws of 1873 effectively outlawed the distribution of contraceptives, pushing condoms into a black market where quality control disappeared and infection rates quietly climbed. Sometimes progress doesn't move in a straight line. Sometimes it gets pushed backward by the very people meant to protect public health. It would take a world war to reverse that trend. During World War I, and even more aggressively during World War II, militaries began systematically distributing condoms to soldiers, not as a moral statement but as a practical necessity. Sexually transmitted infections were sidelining thousands of troops, and commanders realized prevention was cheaper than treatment. Training films, pamphlets, and posters turned condom use into official policy almost overnight, arguably doing more to normalize the object than centuries of quiet pub counter sales ever had. Then, shortly after World War I, the material itself changed again. Latex rubber was developed in the 1920s, and it solved nearly every problem vulcanized rubber still had. Latex condoms were thinner, more elastic, cheaper, and less labor-intensive to produce. And critically, they lasted roughly 5 years on the shelf, compared to the mere months a vulcanized rubber condom could survive before degrading. This is, essentially, the object still sitting in that foil packet today, refined over another century of manufacturing improvements, but fundamentally the same material breakthrough from 100 years ago. Europe wasn't the only place experimenting with this problem either. Long before the 15th century, Japan and China had already developed their own versions, though theirs looked nothing like the full sheath Europeans eventually settled on. In Japan, craftsmen made glands covers, small protective caps rather than full-length sheaths, out of materials like tortoiseshell, animal horn, or oiled silk paper. These weren't comfortable, and they weren't especially effective by modern standards. But they reveal the same underlying instinct showing up independently on opposite sides of the world. Humans, given enough time and enough at stake, keep arriving at some version of the same idea. So why did it take so long for that idea to become something people would actually want to use? Because for most of this history, protection and comfort were in direct competition, and comfort almost always lost. A tortoiseshell cap doesn't move like skin. A washed and re-dried intestine sheath doesn't feel the same the 10th time as it did the first. Every material available before the 1800s asked the user to trade away comfort, sensation, or convenience for a chance at safety. And that trade-off is exactly why so many people, across so many centuries, simply chose to skip it. The technology wasn't just imperfect, it was actively unpleasant, and unpleasant solutions get abandoned no matter how necessary they are. The 20th century added one more chapter that's easy to forget. By the 1980s, latex condoms had already existed for 60 years, quietly improving in a fairly unremarkable, incremental way. Then the HIV and AIDS crisis arrived, and almost overnight, this small, previously unglamorous object became the centerpiece of global public health campaigns. Governments that had spent decades treating condoms as a slightly embarrassing topic suddenly had posters, television ads, and school curricula built around them. Manufacturing standards tightened, testing protocols became more rigorous. Condoms were formally reclassified as medical devices in many countries, subject to the same kind of scrutiny as other health products, not just consumer goods sold quietly behind a counter. Here's the twist worth sitting with. The condom's entire history isn't really a story about sex. It's a story about risk and how differently every era has understood it. Ancient Egyptians were worried about insects. Renaissance Europeans were terrified of syphilis. 20th century governments were managing battlefield readiness. Each generation inherited the same basic problem, and each one reached for whatever material science could offer at the time: linen, gut, vulcanized rubber, latex, refining an old idea rather than inventing a new one. Think about how ordinary that small foil packet looks today, tucked in a drawer, barely worth a second glance. It carries almost none of its own history with it. No trace of Falloppio's trials, no echo of Casanova inflating one to check for holes, no hint of the wartime posters that made it a matter of official policy. It just sits there, quiet and unremarkable, doing a job that people have been trying to perfect since long before anyone wrote it down. That's usually how it goes with the objects we stop noticing. The ones that took the longest to get right are often the ones that end up looking the simplest.